Ethan Cole leaned on the fence outside his weather-worn cabin, hat low, eyes fixed on the trail that cut through the valley. He had lived too many years alone. His only company the creak of wood, the neigh of his horse, and the ghosts of a past he refused to speak of. That evening, he heard it, a faint rustle, like dry grass stirred by more than the breeze. His hand moved to the worn revolver on his belt, but what stumbled into sight was no outlaw. It was a child, a girl no older than 12, barefoot, clothes torn, face streaked with dirt and blood. She swayed with each step, too weak to call for help. Ethan froze. She was Apache. In those lands, that meant danger. Settlers whispered stories of raids and vengeance, of barns burned and cattle stolen. Taking her in would brand him a traitor in the eyes of his neighbors. She was a child forgotten, abandoned, fighting only to breathe. He caught her as she fell. Her lips moved with words he barely understood, fragments of a language carried on the wind. Carefully, he laid her on a blanket inside his cabin, gave her water, and stoked the fire. For days she drifted between fever and silence, until at last she spoke her name, Ayoka. In time, Ethan taught her how to ride the old mare in his corral, how to track deer through broken twigs, how to hold a knife steady against the dark things of the world. She learned quickly, her spirit sharper than any steel, of ancestors who rode the stars. But beyond the cabin walls, whispers grew. The sheriff stopped by more than once, his eyes cold. Neighbors muttered when Ethan came to town for supplies. "You're harboring one of them," they said. "You'll bring trouble on us all." Ethan ignored them, but deep down he knew trouble was coming. On a storm-choked night, the trouble arrived. Ethan stood firm, rifle in hand, but he knew he couldn't fight them all. He pressed a small bundle into Ayoka's hands, food, a knife, and a whispered promise: ride fast, ride far, don't ever forget who you are. Through the downpour, she rode into the darkness, swallowed by the storm. Ethan stood in the doorway long after, rain soaking through his shirt, heart heavy with the fear that he had saved her only to lose her forever. The storm passed, but its memory lingered in the mud and silence around Ethan's cabin. The riders had left when they realized the girl was gone, but their threats echoed. "Next time, we won't ask." For days after, Ethan walked the empty corral where Ayoka once practiced riding, his eyes tracing the hoofprints that vanished into the hills. Every broken twig, every faint mark on the trail pulled at him, but he forced himself not to follow. She needed freedom, not another chain. The town, however, did not forgive so easily. At the saloon, whispers turned to pointed stares. Men spat near his boots, calling him Injun lover. The sheriff pulled him aside, voice low and sharp: "You keep siding with their kind, you'll find yourself on the wrong end of a rope." Ethan said nothing. Words would do no good against men who saw compassion as weakness. Nights grew longer. Alone by the fire, Ethan often found himself staring at the small wooden carving Ayoka had left on his table, a figure of a horse with stars etched along its back. She had carved it during one of their quiet evenings. Hands steady, eyes lost in thought, he held it now as though it carried the weight of her spirit. Seasons shifted. Summers scorched the land, winters froze it to stone. Years blurred together in a rhythm of work, silence, and regret. Ethan aged, the lines on his face deepening, his shoulders bending under years of solitude. Yet the memory of that girl never faded. Sometimes he thought he saw her in the distance, a rider on a ridge, a figure by the river, but each time it was only the wind playing tricks on tired eyes. The people of the town moved on. They built new barns, raised new fences, fought new quarrels. But to Ethan, time remained tethered to that night. The rain, the thunder, and the small figure disappearing into the horizon. He wondered where she had gone. Did she survive? Did she find her people again? Or had he sent her to a fate worse than death? One night, under a sky thick with stars, Ethan spoke aloud to the emptiness: "If you're out there, Ayoka, I hope you found your strength. I hope you remember the lessons. And I hope you remember me." His voice broke in the quiet, carried away by the endless plains. What he didn't know, what no one in that town could have guessed, was that the girl was not gone forever. She was growing, learning, hardening, and 15 years later, she would return not as a child in need, but as a leader with the power to shake the very ground beneath the cowboy's feet. The years rolled on like dust storms across the prairie. carving their mark on Ethan Cole's life. His hair, once the color of chestnut, had turned to streaks of gray. His back bent slightly now when he worked the fence posts, and his hands, scarred from a lifetime of rope and steel, shook more often than he cared to admit. Yet the memory of Ayoko lingered as fresh as the day she vanished into the storm. Every so often, travelers would pass through town carrying stories of the Apache. Some spoke of raids, cattle stolen, wagons burned. Others whispered of gatherings deep in the canyons, where leaders rose among the tribes, uniting those once divided. Ethan listened quietly, never asking questions, but each tale stirred something in his chest. Could she be there among them? The girl who once carved stars into a wooden horse. He tried to bury the thought, but nights refused him peace. In dreams, he saw her, sometimes still the fragile child clutching his hand, sometimes a warrior standing tall with fire in her eyes. Each time he woke, the silence of his cabin felt heavier, like the world itself mocked him with what he had lost. The townsfolk had not forgotten either. For them, Ayoko was a shadow that never quite disappeared. "That Cole fella, he's got Indian blood on his hands," they'd mutter at the saloon. Ethan learned to ignore it. What they didn't know was that the shadow they feared was the light that kept him alive. One evening, while the sun sank red over the hills, Ethan sat on his porch whittling wood. His knife moved without thought, shaving curls of pine into the dirt. When he finally looked down, he realized he had carved the faint outline of a feather. He set it aside, his chest tightening. "If I ever see you again, girl," he whispered to the wind, "I'll not let you ride into the storm alone." The wind shifted then, carrying the distant cry of a hawk across the valley. It felt like an answer, a reminder that the story was not finished. Ethan rose, staring at the endless horizon, unaware that somewhere beyond those ridges, Ayoka's journey was shaping her into someone the world would soon have to reckon with. And though the town had long since dismissed her as nothing more than a forgotten ghost of the past, Ethan carried a truth he never spoke aloud, that kindness given in silence often returns with thunder. He just didn't know when or how. The prairie had a way of keeping secrets. Years passed, but Ethan Cole carried the weight of one night heavier than any saddle he had ever lifted. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of coyotes beyond the ridge reminded him of the girl who had vanished into the storm. Some nights, when the wind was sharp, he swore he could still hear her horse's hooves pounding against the earth. Fading into the distance, Ethan's days followed a steady rhythm, tending cattle, mending fences, riding the same trails until they felt like scars carved into the land. But his mind wandered constantly, circling back to that single choice sending Ayoko away. Had it been mercy, or had it been cowardice? The question gnawed at him like hunger that could never be fed. The town grew colder toward him. Old neighbors stopped tipping their hats when he rode by. Children whispered that he was cursed, the man who had sheltered a ghost. He answered with silence, retreating further into solitude. But sometimes in the middle of the market, he'd catch a stranger's glance lingering a little too long, and wonder if news of her survival had traveled through unseen channels. One winter evening, while tending the fire, Ethan pulled out the small bundle he had kept hidden all these years. The carving of the star-backed horse. The wood had darkened with age, the edges smoothed from his hands holding it too often. He stared at it for a long time, the flames reflecting in his weary eyes. "If you're alive out there, Ayoka," he murmured, "I hope the world gave you more than I did. I hope you became what you were meant to be." The wind answered with a low whistle through the cracks in the cabin walls, and Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes. The night outside stretched wide and silent, but it felt charged, as though something far away was moving closer, step by step. What Ethan could not see was that the girl he once saved had not vanished into nothing. Her path had been hard, carved through trials and pain, but it had forged her into something greater. While he lived in shadows of regret, she was gathering light, drawing strength from every scar, every battle, every loss. And so chapter 1 closes with Ethan alone on his porch, staring into the dark horizon. He does not know it yet, but the choice he made 15 years ago will soon thunder back into his life, not as a fragile child, but as a force that will test the courage of every man and woman in that frontier town. The night held its breath. The story was far from over.